Welcome back to the Andrew Lawton Show. So the new projections from the Ontario government are that the second wave is going to be peaking in October. And this is, of course, timing well with the government telling us that further lockdown measures are potentially coming down the pipeline. We had over the weekend a restriction in place on when bars can serve alcohol and some other businesses. And it seems like we're right back to not necessarily square one, but where we were months ago, which we know was really the death knell for a lot of businesses. And very few people in the provincial legislature have been speaking out against this. One of the only ones, and certainly the loudest, has been Randy Hillier, a former PC MPP, now an independent member of the provincial parliament, who joins me on the line now. Randy, good to talk to you. Thanks very much for coming on today.
Great to be with you, Andrew.
I think the one thing we learned early on in this is that all of the projections that we were told were really the basis of government actions were wrong. And I think we can be very grateful they are, because these were predicting thousands of deaths, ICU capacity overwhelmed. It hasn't happened. So when you hear that now these same projections are looking at an October second wave, what's your reaction?
Well, since March, we certainly had all these dire predictions, these catastrophic models, and thankfully they didn't come to bear. And it's not uncommon for predictions and models to be found to be in error. Like, that's normal. It's very seldom a prediction or a model is factual at the end of the day. And the same thing has happened with COVID. But what we've got ourselves into now is not so much of a healthcare problem or a medical problem, Andrew. We've got, and all Western governments find this, they've got themselves a political problem, a huge political problem, and they're not knowing how to deal with it, and without admitting some errors. And so now we're finding ourselves being told we're in a second wave. But when you look at the evidence that is revealed, the hospitalization rates are flat. The deaths are flat, hardly measurable. But an increasing number of people who are testing positive for some form of coronavirus in their system. And those rates are going up significantly. But the severity and the lethality of the virus is flatlined. But we're still acting politically on the models and the projections that have been dispelled and known to be false.
What drives that? Because politicians don't want to be the ones responsible for shutting down their constituents' businesses and for wreaking economic havoc on their citizens. So how is there a political advantage to what's being proposed?
Well, I don't know if your statement is true, Andrew. The greatest singular priority and importance for a political party and elected people is re-election, and whatever it takes to be reelected. And part of what it takes to be reelected is to have public opinion on your side. And we know that there's a great number of people who are living in fear. And I would say even a great number of people who are terrorized over the 7 months of headlines and consistent and constant reminders of the potential severity of COVID, that there has become a very disturbed element in our society of that we have to act only on our fears and act on those projections. So I don't think Doug Ford or anybody in the PC caucus wants to wreak havoc on our economy. I don't think any of them want to deny access to healthcare like we've been doing to people who need the medical attention. I don't think they want to prevent our kids from going to school, but more importantly is they don't want to have their brand and their reputation tarnished or diminished by admitting that they made mistakes and errors, and they don't know how to diminish or alleviate um, the the level of fear in society, or to communicate what is the appropriate level of risk. What is the risk to people? And as we know, if you're under 80, if you don't have underlying illnesses or in chronic illnesses, this the likelihood of you experiencing of contacting and experiencing severe illness or death is negligible, and they just don't know how to get themselves out of the political problem that they've created.
You are right about that in a lot of ways they've boxed themselves into a corner by how dire their predictions and projections were in March and April. And we're seeing them have to commit to the bit, so to speak, now. Whereas instead of just celebrating, hey, you know what? We had to take this extreme action because we didn't know. Now we do know. That's a win for everyone. Let's try to get back to normal. But that's not what's happening.
And that's not what, this is the nature and the characteristics. These are the attributes of political parties and governments throughout the Western world. So we see them all behaving in a very similar fashion, because no government ever wants to admit an error unless it was for some other government's faulty policies, decades and decades ago. I'll give you the example, like the internment of Japanese in Canada. That recognition of the error happened 50 years later.
Mm-hmm.
The recognition of wrongdoing with residential schools happened many decades after. Governments, they know that if they admit errors and failings, that tarnishes their brand, it tarnishes their narrative, and it limits their potential for re-election. And that's really, we've got ourselves a huge political problem that some people think is a healthcare problem.
You were out of the PC caucus a year and a half ago. I think it was March 2019. Had that not happened, and had you still been in, do you think you would have been out now over the course of the PC government's conduct in the last few months?
Without a doubt. Yeah, there was no way. Like, it became evident to most people, late April. By late April, certainly early part of May, it was clear the projections, the apocalypse, and these catastrophic outcomes weren't going to happen. And I did speak out in the House in May. I challenged and spoke strongly against the continuation of the state of emergency. And there's another good example, Andrew, where the state of emergency was finally ended in, the end of July. However, the government has retained all the extreme and extraordinary measures as if it was still in a state of emergency.
As though the issue was with the term state of emergency and not all of the powers that came along with that.
So we have an unelected, unaccountable COVID command table who the premier will not identify who's all involved in that. He will not reveal the agenda, the minutes, the communications. It's all hidden from our view. And they are allowed to come out with these outrageous edicts, like what happened last Saturday. A week ago, Thursday, the premier said, we're going to a regional approach on new restrictions. And he announced on Thursday restrictions for Toronto, Ottawa, and Mississauga. Well, Saturday morning, he came out and said, no, we're going province-wide, and these new restrictions are province-wide, and they take effect now. And I had people just calling me in tears, Andrew. They had weddings planned that afternoon. They had guests in from around the province and elsewhere. And the government just said, now what you're planning is unlawful if you have more than 25 people in your backyard. Um, and we've seen this, and I'll say to you, Andrew, like that is the first time in my life that I have seen any government in Canada yeah, announce an arbitrary decision that takes effect now. No lead time, no day or 2 days grace or anything. It's now, and remember, there was no debate, there
Hmm.
was no discussion, there was no vote. Like that is not how a representative democracy functions. We don't have um, um, emperor-like authorities without checks and balances provided to our premier, but now we do.
I want to ask you about your sort of role as in many cases that the one man opposition to this, because even the official opposition, the NDP and what's left of the Liberals in the Ontario legislature, they're criticizing the government's specific decisions, but typically those criticisms are along the lines of you're not doing enough, not where you're going, which is you're doing too much. I know Belinda Carajalios, who was a PC MPP, and we had her on the show a few weeks back. She's been kicked out for criticizing some of the emergency powers. But are you finding any quiet support from people in the legislature, perhaps your own former colleagues that are saying privately, yeah, I don't have a lot of issues with this, but aren't speaking out publicly? Or are you one of the only people that's seeing the issues that you're describing right now?
No, this is the great falsehood that we're being led to believe is a fact when it's a falsehood. I will say to you, Andrew, not just colleagues in the legislature, but the public. Um, although I stated there's a great number of people who are living in fear and in terror, um, a great many people. I don't know if it's a majority, but it's pretty close if it isn't. Um, I understand and see the um, the falsehood that's being played out. Okay, but due to public pressure, due to political correctness, due to the fear of public backlash from this irrational conventional wisdom that we've embraced, they're hesitant to speak out. And that goes certainly with a lot of my former colleagues, um, other members of the legislature, and the public at large. You may have seen one of my videos. I've spoken with lots of physicians. Most or a great many of them believe our COVID policies are causing more harm than good. They're causing greater injury and greater fatality than any good that they're doing. However, there is such a reluctance and such a hesitation to speak truthfully about COVID for fear of retribution by their public sector employer, the hospitals, or by their regulatory body, the College of Physicians and Surgeons. And we see this permeating throughout our society. Nobody wants to say the emperor has no clothes, or in this case, the premier has no clothes. But a great number of people know that it's true.
So, what's the Randy Hillier plan here? Because you're not saying that this is a sham and we shouldn't do anything. You mentioned earlier that we need to protect the vulnerable and look out for the population that really needs the help and needs the protection. What would you like to see go into effect today?
Well, just what we need to come into effect today is the same thing that we need to come into effect every day. And that's our ability to be able to speak truthfully and honestly. And that's really the crux of the problem. Um, our media, the mainstream media, thankfully, there's yourself, there's a few other media outlets who are allowing people to speak truthfully. But most of our mainstream media have jumped on this bandwagon, this scare wagon, this wagon of fear, and it's good for headlines, and it's good for um, that audience. Um, but and I don't think they understand how complicit they are in preventing an honest, truthful discussion. But I think if we did, and when that day comes when we can speak truthfully about COVID, we should look at this like what it actually is: a virus, a virus that doesn't have apocalyptic characteristics, a virus that doesn't have catastrophic outcomes. It's a virus like so many other viruses. There are some differences. Certainly, for the elderly and the chronically ill, it is much more likely to cause severe harm. But we should be treating this as a medical problem, not as a political problem. And that's the hardest thing that I have ever found in politics, Andrew, is to get politicians to speak truthfully.
Well, thankfully, you are one of the few that is without hesitation. Randy Hillier, Ontario MPP for Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston. Good to talk to you again, Randy. Thanks very much for coming on today.
Great talking with you, Andrew. Bye-bye.